during the time that we were protesting, I became disillusioned with the pace of change that we could actualize through the mechanism of protest, or through the.
Is this at UCT?
This is at UCT, yes. Through the praxis of protest. And so I was like, what are more, and this is quite controversial, but I'll say it anyways because it's my story. What are more constructive utilizations of my anger? Because I can't protest for the rest of my life. I have to find a way to channel the anger and energy that I have into something that can have fixed outcome timelines for results. Most of the work of labeling is more external than internal. It's great, like for you, like, but it's a feigning happiness or excitement in comparison to, say, like what it does for ease of communication. That queerness or that ambiguity or the non-normativeness extended into the question of gender, extended into the question of what I'm going to do with my life, extended into the question of what I even studied, you know.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Safe Space, the podcast where I invite people over, typically my friends, family, and acquaintances, to come share their life story, the lessons that they've learned, in order to invoke transformative change within us and inspire us, motivate us to keep pushing in our own lives. So for this episode, I was thinking about, like, what are we going to focus on? From the previous episodes, we've been on this journey of becoming, in terms of becoming an actuary, becoming a multi-potentialite. And I thought, let's dig deeper. One of the major issues, the major challenges, is actually the issue of identity, right? And I feel like we've kind of sidestepped it and not really given it enough attention, because your identity pretty much determines how you relate to the rest of the world, right? So it's one of the fundamental things that one has to get right when they're relatively young and growing up. So my question was, like, what happens when you don't fit in, right? You're growing up, you're trying to find yourself, but within the available options that society provides, you can't locate yourself. Even worse, instead of locating yourself, you actually receive backlash in terms of your identity going against societal norms. And I wanted to give more insight, and us to, get more insight in terms of like, what does a person do when they encounter that? So when I thought of a guest, I really wanted to bring someone who really has had an uphill battle in terms of their identity. We spoke about how a person has multiple aspects, right? So this particular individual is an entrepreneur, is a trans person, is also an activist, and pretty much has had an uphill battle in terms of like their life's journey. So it was without a doubt that it had to be Mlingani Matiwane.
Yeah.
And we actually go way back. Me and Nimli, we're actually transgender siblings. We found each other at the front lines of the transgender movement back at UCT when we started the Trans Collective.
Mm-hmm.
And, post-university, our relationship has really grew along with us, to the extent that, one day we might even be business partners.
Yeah, most likely.
But yeah, we have a strong and sacred bond, and I can't wait for you to hear their life's journey.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Tato. It's always an interesting opportunity, obviously, to speak about what I'll actually just call the gender journey in general, and make it a bit more broader than just the question of gender. The question of transness. So obviously, like when I was super, super young, the not fitting in part was very salient. So from about grade 1 to grade 2, I did get bullied a lot because of being quite effeminate, and I was quite docile as well. And things were quite difficult at home as well. So it was a multiplicity of things, and there was like lots of politics about being young in that setting. Fortunately, it was a co-ed school. That would change obviously the older I got. But yeah, I mean, I was bullied, and I was bullied in grade 1, in grade 2, and then halfway through grade 2, I made a decision that I was not going to get bullied anymore. And that was my first foray into what became a standard theory in my life, which was that I actually need to be more forceful. I need to be a bit more aggressive. I need to not allow the ebbs and flows of life to govern how I live, but I need to take a front seat. And that's where the extremeness started as well. So my first company was actually, I started in grade 2.
Wow.
And that was my first company. And it was called RI because I had a group of friends that were interested in rapping. But I couldn't rap. So the fastest way for me to organize was that I then mobilized the microphones and like cassette tapes for people to rap onto. And then I basically gave everyone in the whole grade, this is obviously a form of bullying as well, but I gave everyone in the whole grade a position in the company. Whether they were useful or not was irrelevant. I mean, we're in grade 2. But what was important was that the people that were bullies were not allowed to have a stake in this company. That was the first foray into more activist work as well. So we ostracized the people that used to bully us, and we ran our own institution. And that was my first foray into climbing social hierarchies in order to protect myself and protect the identity that was presenting, even though I didn't have the language to explain what it was. And so yeah, so then we move from that period and then we come to today, right? I then leave home in about grade 7, grade 8, and I start a completely new life because I felt that the life that King Williamstown, which is my hometown, offered me was just too constraining for how big and broad my visions and ambitions were. So then I moved to East London and went to Selborne, and then got bullied again at Selborne. I thought that the bullying thing was now finished and I had dealt with it and I squashed my bullies. But new environment, new social hierarchy to climb. And that becomes a recurring theme as well, like, right? So as a means of protection against the world and its prejudices and whatnot, is to just find the social hierarchy that you have to climb it as quickly as possible, and then be in a position where people can't do anything to you, where the weight of your presence and the gravity of your engagement and your entering of spaces protects you by default. So you substitute social capital for what you lose in non-conformity.
Like personal capital.
Yes, yeah. So obviously got bullied again at Selborne. Obviously this time I was like, I know what this is. So I didn't have a straight route for social hierarchy to climb in grade 8 because that's not how boys' schools are set up. So I left the school. I went home, and then I came back in grade 10, right? Built a lot of myself actually while I was in King Williamstown. Got a lot more free with my ideas of gender. Started dating someone as well. And they were very, very supportive of like me being like open about like my gender and also my sexuality. And we dated for about 5 years, and that was super, 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 like those were very, very good years. I have nothing negative to say about them. And then obviously I came back to Selborne, grade 10, and then found the correct hierarchies to climb. And
so before Selborne, where were you when you were having your first dating experience?
That was at Dale College. Which is in King Williamstown. Came back to Selborne, and then was able to climb. I mean, at Dale was very easy. I climbed the social hierarchies by just being number 1 in the grade and stuff like that. And then obviously like I was like senior in debating and all of these other things. But the important thing was that I knew that I couldn't stay at home again because it's a constrained growth environment. So I had to go to Selborne, and I went to Selborne, and I faced my demons, and I fought, and I climbed the hierarchies, and eventually became deputy head student there. So even though I hadn't actually been there the whole 5 years, which was, I mean, thanks to the guys for seeing that leadership capacity in me. But it was all part of this social hierarchy climbing self-protection mechanism thing. And yeah, I mean, that spills over then into university as well, and all of that things that happen there.
Interesting. So, you know what interests me? I had sort of like a similar response to like my gender in high school as well, where, you know, in order to shield me from the bullying, I also resorted to being number one.
Yeah.
And, you know, it provided such great shelter for me. But also at the same time, don't you think we missed out on opportunities to grow in other ways by actually not sitting and facing the bullying head on?
I think psychologically, the positioning yourself to be protected from what the world is going to do to you is an unusual and unnecessary disruption to normal cognitive development, right? Because now we have hangovers from this intense fear that at any moment our position can be questioned, our position can be disheveled, etc. So we did lose a bit in that process, and we could have probably been doing much more exciting things than than building buttresses around ourselves, right? But then on the other hand, I think, I mean, like, if you just think about the story, the intertwining of entrepreneurship and activism that was spurred on by that.
Yes.
I can't replace that with anything, right? The bullying had to exist in order for that to come out of me, right? So when I do the calculus between what I've lost and what I've gained, it skews towards the positive.
It skews towards the positive. Yeah, and I really liked how when you talked about the interaction between bullying and entrepreneurship. I mean, what I find inspiring is, you know, you always took charge. And, you know, with like traumatic events, like the sooner you take charge, the better, right?
Yeah.
The better outcome it is for you psychologically. Yeah. So then take us to what happened when you got to university.
To uni. Okay. So at uni, this was now, okay, I want us to quickly go back to high school quickly, before we get into uni. Because by the time that I got to uni, I had actually gotten properly exposed to the world, right? I traveled abroad for debating and, like, you know, really got an opportunity to, like, see beyond the box that I was being brought up in. So that by the time I got to uni, I think that was after Turkey, that was after ESTC, which is Eurasian Schools Debating Champs. And that was a really, really interesting experience for me to get to uni, because I had really grandiose visions about what uni was, right? I watched too much TV and whatnot and was like, okay, like, uni is just going to be this plethora of just the smartest people in the world just sitting and thinking all the time, which is what my dream world was at the time, right? I was still thinking that I was going to be an academic, which I eventually did do anyways. But, like, yeah, I mean, we get to uni. First few weeks, I joined the Treasury Committee at College House. I do that kind of stuff. I climb the hierarchies again. Like, I find out what hierarchies I need to climb, and I climb them as soon as I get to university. And by June, solid position, I'm fine. Everybody knows not to, like, do bad things to me or whatever. I did go to a boys' residence, which was so triggering for me, having gone through the process of going through a boys' school, that I think I even redoubled my efforts in being aggressive and, you know, like, making sure that I established myself. So yeah, so that's what happens at uni.
So wait, can you just go back? How did you survive? Like, what was the coping mechanism in terms of, like, living in a boys' race? Like, how did you actually? Because you were there for varsity 2 years and then school for 3 years. That's 5 years. So, like, how did you manage to still grow? Because I imagine, like, even in your own gender identity, were you growing at the time? Like, how were you processing all of that?
I went through something quite complicated. Now we're getting into it. It's fine. Let's go.
Okay.
The the peculiar thing for me about gender, especially when I was in high school, is that I moved from being comfortable with non-specific language around my gender to university where everything is intellectualized and everything has a name and everyone has a set of schema and rules and roles that they fit as a result of all the different names that they associate themselves with. Now, I then left the safety of ambiguity in language, right, in high school, where even me with the person I was dating, we would like switch pronouns around and do like interesting, fun stuff like that. But then when I got to uni, that liberty was a bit questioned. That okay, you actually need to know what you are, who you are, so that we can place you in the right circles, and that's how we can basically manage you. Right?
So the
labeling,
it started in varsity.
Right, started in varsity most aggressively. And the labeling got so intense that I started mislabeling myself, which was a very, 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 very peculiar experience where you're being bombarded by so much new language that you then start trying out to fit yourself in them. And I remember at some point I was bi-gender, and at some point I was this and that, and at some point I was a lot of different things. And none of them felt comfortable, and a lot of it felt reactive rather than endogenous, right? Or fundamental. It felt like it was being done for the ease of understanding of other people rather than for myself. Which is something that I think, of course, is a common occurrence or common feeling amongst what we have now started calling the pre-trans person, right?
What is the pre-trans person?
The pre-trans person is a trans person who hasn't yet associated themselves with that label, or with the label of transness, that is, right? Or is on a journey of exploring what it means to be non-normative within the gender context. And yeah, I mean, and I'm saying that in my journey during my pre-trans process, right? And I'll even call it pre-trans still, even though I was like giving names to this thing, because it wasn't me, right? It was names that I was taking from books and discussions with other people and so on. It wasn't me saying, okay, this is actually who I am and this is how I associate with myself and so on. So yeah, I mean, back to your question about how did I survive? I think the material, I mean, my survival mechanism was just this hierarchies thing, you know, like always protecting myself, always making sure that I'm important in any room that I enter, and that people do take me seriously, and that will squash or they don't need to believe or understand or whatever. They just need to be subdued enough not to bring their problems to me, with me, the problems about me to me. They can even gossip about me like outside and whatever. I really couldn't be bothered, but that can't now start affecting my daily like life or my lived experience.
So I hear you, right? Labeling. So labeling it can have multiple outcomes, right?
Yeah.
You label as the result of you trying to understand yourself, right? But then you're talking about a certain kind of pressure to label, right? Which is much more insidious than that, right? Because the pressure element speaks to like the colonial context of categorizing, demarcating.
The anthropological and more biological view.
Yes.
Right? Which needs categories. Which
needs categories, right? And then not only that, but when you start involving power dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And start like putting in laws to punish, especially using the state apparatus.
Just,
in the legal system and even firepower, right, wars, to try and make sure that you impose the system of categorizing, right? So there's that element. Is there a form of activism in labeling? And are
Yes.
there other elements what other dynamics are there?
So the intention behind labeling is 90% of the time positive, right? The intention is to find a home, right, in yourself, to find community. Sometimes it can also be that. It can also be about resolving cognitive dissonance, right, which is a very uncomfortable psychological state of being, where
What is cognitive dissonance? Sorry.
cognitive dissonance is where there's a disjoint between either your feelings and your intellect, or between your beliefs or whatever. So any kind of psychological phenomena wherein there's a disjoint, and that disjoint causes internal distress, right? That's cognitive dissonance. So people can self-identify and look towards labels as a mechanism to resolve that cognitive dissonance. And that is revolutionary for them, and it gives them a lot of space and latitude to explore themselves, right? So that's good in terms of labeling, right? So it is a mechanism for self-actualization. It is a mechanism for speaking and seeing and being yourself in ways that you can at least describe as well. Because the ambiguity also can be a bit scary, right? Not knowing who you are, or not knowing what to call what you are, can make interpersonal relationships a bit more complicated, because then now somebody wants to date you and you're like, sorry, I don't date such and such a gender, because of whatever the case may be. So there's an interpersonal or intergroup relations aspect to this as well. So, and this is why I'm saying, like, for me, most of the work of labeling is more external than internal. It's great, like, for you, like, but it's a feigning happiness or excitement, in comparison to, say, like, what it does for ease of communication. Yeah.
Wow. So back to the dating conversation.
Sure.
You spoke about how, when did you say you started dating someone?
In grade 9.
In grade 9.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, how were you dating then? Like, how was it like dating growing up, dealing with ambiguity? Because you just mentioned now that, it makes it difficult to actually connect or relate to someone if you actually don't have an idea of
What it is.
familiarity. So yeah, so can you just tell us more about that?
So I obviously fortunately had someone that was really, really supportive. We played the ambiguity game with each other. It was fine. It was chilled. They knew that that I was unusual prior to us dating. And they gave me an enormous amount of latitude when it came to the question of, like, self-discovery and exploration and all of that. But I was quite strictly monogamous. So most of this exploration was not in, like, a physical way or anything of that nature. It was like, just, oh, okay, these are feelings that I have towards people of the same gender or people of different gender, and so on. And we'd actually, like, talk about it. Like, it was an open, like, conversation. We would talk about it. So yeah, for me, the question of dating has always been a bit easy in my eyes, to be honest. I don't really find it to be a difficult thing to do. Yeah, I have phases in my life where I feel like I need to date someone, and I go and I date. And then there are phases when I don't. And that's literally it. I don't stress over it. I don't cry over it. I don't cry over it. I don't stress over it. It's just, yeah. I mean, that's
so nice. Like, I'm having the exact opposite experience. And it's because, yeah, so I wasn't dating then. I was solely focused on, being number one and getting out of my hometown. Yeah, so let's also talk about now what happened when you got to varsity. Tell us more.
So get to varsity, the 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 lines that were easy to stay within in high school stopped existing, right? So now new things are being introduced, alcohol, like a university with 27,000 people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now things get a bit more complicated. And my first like proper crisis with gender starts, right? It started with panic attacks, then diagnosed with panic disorder. And to boil it down to what I was actually fearful of, right? Because panic disorder is just an anxiety disorder that is physical in nature. Like it's yeah, you have multiple panic attacks per day. And that was and it's difficult to detangle the cause, right? If it was just because of this reckoning with myself on the question of gender, or if it was that and everything else that I was doing, right? The movement and Fees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, all of these other things. And the amount of responsibility that I took for other people's lives as a result of being in that state. But yeah, so I do reach a reckoning with myself in 2016, which is second year for me. And I enter an enormous, a very deep, very protracted depression as well. And it was painful, but there was a large part of me that felt like it was necessary, because as you even said earlier, we sidestepped having to deal with these things by either climbing hierarchies, being number one, whatever the case may be. So now those pent up emotions came to fruition now, and we're like, you actually need to deal with us. You know, we understand what you've done for the external world, but we internally now need you to deal with all the loose ends that you've left as a result of creating safety for yourself in the big world. And that was what really, really collapsed me. And so I took a leave of absence for that. That's how serious it got. For about 6 months, I didn't go to school. And that's quite intense for me as well, right? Because my entire identity, separate from the gender one, is based on achievement and, you know, performance and, you know, all of these things. So now I'm going through a phase where I can't even lean on those things now because I've taken a leave of absence from school. And I must now deal with the reality of my emotions and my feelings and what I'm going through. And I'm also in the process, as I said, misgendering myself and calling myself things that I'm not and all of that kind of stuff as well. And then being sad about it afterwards, as if I should have known before, like, you know. So yeah, so varsity was extremely, extremely difficult in that regard. And it although I've resolved a lot of that in therapy and all of that, it still has haunting emotions that last to this day, right? For example, like, I mean, we've spoken about it a bit, but things like how to navigate transness now in the context that I'm in, and the pulling myself back a bit and the giving as my and basically being trans on a need to know basis to some extent, like for the external world, as part of like balancing all of these interests that exist in the world that need me to be certain things at certain points for different people and different institutions. So yeah, that was the uni journey.
So, you know, when you talk about the pressure of self-labeling, it reminds me of like how, you know, typically, you know, a trans person would start out as a gay person, right? I've seen that happen. I went through that journey
Me
as
too.
well. And like, you know, one of the most difficult things that people like don't understand is this. Now when when your understanding becomes nuanced and you understand like the difference between sexuality and gender. Yeah, so did you ever go through such a consideration? Like how did you approach that?
For me, I can say that, interestingly enough, the question of gender was more salient or prescient than the question of sexuality. my sexuality is, I mean, I can easily say it's probably been pansexual since forever, right? I've never been in a position where I can say I'm
What
only
is
attracted.
pansexuality?
Pansexuality just means I'm attracted to people independent of their genders. So regardless of what gender they are, if I like you, and that's that on that. So I've never been in a position where I'm like, okay, I'm exclusively interested in girls or exclusively interested in guys or exclusively interested in whatever. That has never been a problem for me. I skipped that step, fortunately for myself. So the question of gender has always been the most senior question for me. And it has always been the one that consumes my head when it comes to that specific question of identity. Now, where the interesting thing between the intersection of the two happens for me is on the question of just being non-normative, right? So the queer experience or the sexuality experience is what gives me it manifests in the way of not being constrained. And that philosophy obviously extended to every single part of my life, including the question of gender, which is why even on the question of gender, when asked to make a definitive statement on what gender I am, actually, we are unlikely to get a solid answer to that question for a very long time to come, right? But what we do know is that it's non-normative, right? So that queerness or that ambiguity or the non-normativeness extended into the question of gender, extended into the question of what I'm going to do with my life, extended into the question of what I even studied. You know, like, I mean, as you remember, I was at UCT for 4 years, if not 5. And I studied every single thing under the sun. I went from XI to like medicine and everything in between, you know. And then ultimately settled on what I really wanted to do, which was behavioral economics. But yeah, I mean, like just taking the untraveled path or the non-normative path is just permeating. It's permeated every single aspect of my life. So I've never had to feel like I'm navigating between the transition from the conversation of sexuality or being gay to transness because I'd never seen myself as gay in the first place. And then the conversation just went to the question of gender like immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it is like, I can see what you mean by that because you were grounded in a separate, like from the system, from this labeling and stuff, you were grounded in a certain identity of yours, which is around non-conformity, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of like affected, like defined how you lived in your multiple dimensions. You said that when you go into different spaces, you have to kind of like wear a certain mask, right?
Yeah.
So, in terms of your career choice, because obviously your gender identity journey and your trans journey is like the background, right? But in
The
varsity,
foreground.
the foreground. But you also had to now figure out like what you wanted to study and what, like you said, you studied everything under the sun.
Yeah.
So how did you go about like relating, like, finding yourself outside of your gender identity, despite it, causing so much
Turmoil. Um, we always make this joke that we're bureaucrats, right? And that actually is quite a salient Freudian slip, really. It's a true statement, right? That's how I organized finding myself outside of this specific question. Is I buttressed myself, with the smartest people, people I shouldn't have access to, but made sure I got access to them. For example, I didn't go to O Week for most of O Week. Most of the time during O Week, I was meeting academics, like seriously going into what is this discipline? Why are we doing this? What does this do for the world? How is humanity like made better by pursuing X and Y question? I remember the first meeting I had was with Don Ross, was the dean of commerce at the time and head of Ruben, which is the research unit in behavioral and neuroeconomics. And we had that conversation, and I was like, Don, I want to do neuroeconomics. And he was like, no, it's not, don't do that. Maybe do behavioral finance or behavioral economics, but don't go all the way to neuroeconomics. It's going to constrain your options quite early.
Neuroeconomics, what's that? I've never heard of that.
Neuroeconomics is the study that tries to deal with choice theory through understanding biology rather than just understanding behavioral responses. So obviously in psychology, we have cognitions, which is the thoughts that happen inside your head. You have your behaviors, which is the things you react. And then obviously you have your cognitions, behaviors. I forget now the last one. But basically what Don was saying is, oh yes, and then obviously you have your biological hormonal processes, which are autonomic, right? They're automatic processes. And some of that will come from your subconscious, some of that will come from hormones and everything else and whatnot, an endocrinological space. But ultimately, yeah, so neuroeconomics does experiments where you let's say you're testing for selfishness, or you're testing for what's something else. Let's take selfishness as an example. And you run your experiment, and throughout the experiment, you've hooked people up to an ECG or an MRI or some kind of machine that you can track how those the choices they make, right? Because ultimately, economics is about choice. It's a choice theory subject. That's the center of economics, is the distribution of finite resources in a world of infinite wants and needs, right? So it's a choice. That's what we're really studying. So it moves the conversation from just experiments that are theoretical to more biologically based hypotheses, and then you test those and you prove those. So that's what neuroeconomics was. So that was what I came to UCT thinking I wanted to study. And then I saw all these other things, and they were so exciting. And I had a scholarship from Alan Gray, so shout out to Alan Gray. But I also felt like I didn't really need to rush myself on figuring out what I needed to do, because there is this institution that's willing to subsidize my studies. So, I mean, it's not coming from my parents. I have more freedom to really, really, really explore all the corners of my intellect with peace, right? And I did do that. I moved faculties 3 or 4 times, moved departments almost 7 times, and changed my degree about the same number of times as well. So that's also part of the non-normative hypothesis that we've set, right? Is that I built the system that would allow me to have my fun and do what I wanted to do, and then I lived through it. I lived it out in the middle of everything else that was going on at UCT with the movement and so on.
With the movement,
yeah.
Okay, so let's chat a bit about the movement because you talked about like when you face this. Let's call it a conundrum, for lack of a better word, in terms of your gender identity.
Yeah.
There were like 2 sides. There was the personal and the
external.
And there was the external. And you mentioned how you focused a lot on the external, right? The external response, which is getting involved in a university. So, yeah, one thing that's very interesting about Mli, y'all, is you became director of an institute at UCT. As a student, and I mean director, not student director. And I think that's when I started seeing, no man, but Mli is like, a special child, like, because you created that institution.
Yes.
So can you just tell us more about like when you went ahead and wanted to do the activism, right? Like, what motivated you to want to do it at the very highest level?
Okay. I mean, a Freudian answer to your question has obviously already been given, which is the history of bullying, right? There's an enormous amount of anger that you build up in yourself when you're bullied. Some of it is rational, some of it is irrational, right? Sometimes some of it is projection and all of that. So for me, again, within any structure, the first thing is that I must climb the hierarchy as quickly as possible. If there's a structure, then I must find a way to climb that social hierarchy. That's where my safety is being at the highest level of whatever it is that I'm doing. And then everybody else will it creates the necessary boundary around me, or force field, or whatever you want to call it, that makes me feel safe. Then the next thing is I then need to feel like when I've already now gained the social capital or whatever and climbed the hierarchy, I must now feel like I really am adding serious value, because now there are responsibilities that come with being in certain kinds of positions. And that is where the thinking broadly and coming up with things takes place. And I do think order does matter there, right? I climb the hierarchy and I figure out afterwards really how to optimize on it. And so yeah, so I mean, during the activist years, and this is during the activist years, the work was to support the current activist regime, which was Rose Must Fall at the time, but not to be too aggressive with it, because I was still building myself in other ways and elsewhere. And then I got very, very deep into it, and then obviously climbed that social hierarchy as well quite quickly, and then came into the leadership of Shackville TRC and all of the rest of it when all of our friends got expelled and all the bad things happened. And that's how the unit was actually founded, right? So during the time that we were protesting, I became disillusioned with the pace of change that we could actualize through the mechanism of protest, or through the.
Is this at UCT?
This is at UCT, yes. Through the praxis of protest. And so I was like, what are more, and this is quite controversial, but I'll say it anyways because it's my story. What are more constructive utilizations of my anger? Because I can't protest for the rest of my life. I have to find a way to channel the anger and energy that I have into something that can have fixed outcome timelines for results, right? And that's how, in the agreement between Shackville TRC, the candidates, and the university executive management, a clause was built in, which I put in together with the assistance of Ihsan Basir and whoever was the director of alumni and stuff. I think that was Russell. We built this institution into the agreement that once the protests end, the next stage now is going to be researching in great amounts of detail all the different models for free education, how to implement them, comparing them to international standard, and so on, so that if we really think about what the role of the university is in the debate about free education, that is supposed to be the first step that the university is supposed to answer, is to prove feasibility to the institution, to the broader state, right? Because the state has a really, really scary job of allocating very sensitive money, which is people's tax rands, across infinitely very serious needs. And once you start trying to propose that money gets distributed to a class of people who by default are in theory supposed to perform better than the general population in general by virtue of having gone to university in the first place, you need to think broader than just this is a good thing or a bad thing, but also what does it mean for asset allocation, and so on and so on and so on. So then we did that research, and that was the unit that I was directing at the School of Economics. I think I used to be at room 413.
Yeah.
So
what a time.
What a time, right? So we did that, and it was extremely, extremely interesting work. And then
you mean like that's very noble, hey? Because like around the time Shackville TRC, that one of the major demands. What was the Shackville TRC main aim for the protest again?
There were three main general aims. The first one was the Bring Back Arcaders movement, which was to return the people that had been punished by the university during the Rose Must Fall and Peace Must Fall protests. And that's what the TRC was about, right? The actual Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people would go and there was an IRTC which was formed, right? Institutional Reconciliation and Transformation Committee, which included eminent people from South Africa, former judges, ministers, ombuds, etc., and we constituted that, right? And people would go and meet their cases there, and then they would get forgiven. They'd be granted amnesty, rather, or clemency for whatever it is that they did. Then the next thing was supporting the demand for free education, but in more ways than just saying with our mouths, we want free education, right? Formalizing it into an actionable set of steps and giving the state options rather than saying, well, okay, the annual bill for free education would probably be around 30 billion rand and you're going to do it this way, right? That's unfortunately not how politics or lobbying works at the highest levels. So you give the options, you get support from the international community or IEJ, like Institute for Economic Justice and whatever, and then you posit those to the state. Now, the nice thing about UCT, obviously, is that people do listen when UCT says, like when UCT releases an academic report, especially on CHE, like or on higher education questions. So we were able to do that. And then the last major demand for Chatbot TRC was obviously what I'll call the general running theme demands, right? Financial exclusion, residence, etc., etc.
Yeah, the every year
struggles. The every year struggles, right? But it was a unique thing that we added this unit because we were the biggest reason why I needed this to happen was because we were starting to get interesting thoughts from Kaya Sitole and a few other people, and everybody was coming up with different models for how this might happen. But there was no synthesis or coordinated methodology for how to look at this and make it sustainable over an extended period of time, especially for a developing country in Africa. So that was my experience with
Chatbot. So there was like an activism stage, right? But then obviously we graduated.
Yes.
And how was it then leaving university? Like what happened? Like you ended up going into energy, becoming an energy entrepreneur. So yeah, can you just tell us like what happened after varsity? Like, and how did your activism change with you?
I'll repeat that
because you did mention the part around your activism changing from protesting to finding other means. So I'm kind of wondering, so what is the mean now?
What are the means? So like as I said, I had to find more constructive ways to deal with my anger, right? So my activism for a longer time was just me raging against the world, right? Just burn it down, destroy, whatever. And then obviously during the process, coming up with the idea for the research unit, that was already the first major shift. That, okay, my activism now is no longer going to look like picketing. It's going to look like me organizing research so that our aims can be met and we're not at the mercy of the state doing this stuff for us. So we're not going to beg the state, please do a feasibility study. No, we're going to do the feasibility study, bring it to you, and then say, why aren't you doing this, right? Which is a very different kind of way of approaching this, where that gives you a bit of power as well in terms of determining the outcomes of what you're trying to do. So I finished school, obviously. I worked for the unit from 2016 to about 2019. And then 2020, I leave university. I finish uni, and then it got very, very, very hectic because there were so many things happening at the same time. Obviously now, like, we're auditing so that I can come back and become a full fellow of Alan Gray, and lots of stuff was taking place. But then COVID happened, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to me. It was a horrible thing, obviously, for the whole world, but I really, 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 really enjoyed level 5 lockdown specifically, where I went home and got to spend, I think it was like 4 weeks or something crazy like that, just sitting and thinking extremely deeply about what happens next. So now uni is finished. You've gotten you've done what you wanted to do in that space. And you can't stay a student activist for the rest of your life. And you've been given too many opportunities to stay there also now. You need to now start making a proper impact on South Africa and the global South / Africa more aggressively. So then I spent about 2 of the 4 weeks doing an enormous amount of research into what the most valuable or the highest impact sectors are. And I quantified them for each rand put in, what is the multiplied return from investment. And I came to the conclusion that in the global South, that happens at the intersection of the food, water, and energy nexus. And then I said, okay, sure. So which one do we start with? Is it food? Is it water? Is it energy? And then it became clear that energy is an additive process to every single thing that happens in any other industry, including agriculture and water. So for as long as that question is unanswered or is not solved for, we will always be chasing our tails.
Which is what we're doing right now.
Right? So I needed to find a way to deal with energy questions. So I left university. I like studying. So my obvious next step for me was I must just enroll in a program in energy, which I did. Went to UJ, started my honors in energy. And then called Pele, a friend of mine who was quite senior at Pele at the time, and was like, okay, guys, I want to start an energy company, but obviously I don't know how to do it. And I need to learn how to do it. So can I please come and work at your company? And can you rotate me as much as possible so that I can learn this industry and then have the know-how to go and execute on it? I'm also obviously upskilling myself technically through the degree, but I do still need to go into the
and get the field work.
Yeah, get the field work. Then I did go to Pele, very traditional corporate environment. Behaves a bit like a startup, but isn't. It's a proper large corporate, you know. So that was super interesting work that we did there, and I had a lot of fun. And I was rotated a lot. I moved from natural energy, which is fossil fuels, to renewables and everything in between, from business development all the way to project development and everything in between. So completed that training there, and then the opportunities started coming to me and not the other way around, right? So businesses started wanting to approach me and wanting me to help them either on a consulting basis or on like project financing basis and whatnot. And that's where we are now. And I want to harken back to your statement or question rather, which was, what is my protest or activist mechanism now? My mechanism of it's not protest, it's activism. My mechanism for activism now is starting institutions that will solve the problems that I want directly, not in some third order process way or whatever. If there's a problem with energy and I can make myself useful, then I'm going to go and make myself, like, upskill myself and learn how to do it. And I'm going to go directly into the field and I'm going to start solving the problem. And that's how my activism looks now.
Oh, so then there's the field of energy. Are there any other passions that you've been taking along with you? Or are you solely focused on one goal at a time? So you want to deal with the energy question, or?
I mean, if you follow my logic, there's a philosophy behind why energy, right? The moment that philosophy becomes untrue, which the Hammanskraal situation and all of the other ones are starting to allude to, right? The moment other priorities start moving higher than the question of energy, which in South Africa is not going to happen for the next 10 to 15 years anyways. Yeah, so I think, I mean, what else am I interested in? I am interested in agriculture, obviously. We do have agricultural operations in the Eastern Cape, 2 farms, 158 hectares, 150
feeding
hectares. Feeding people. But basically, the point is, at the base of my philosophy for my activism now, and my entrepreneurship as a result of that, is that all the things that people need as basic to happen must be dealt with so that they can have the freedom to do what they want, right? You'll notice that in Africa, there's been a resurgence of like large tech companies coming about, or like fintech and all these other things. Now, you can't build a tech industry if there's no electricity, right? There is an order to this thing, right? So the goal of infrastructure is to be an enabler for everybody
Other
else,
industries.
so for other industries. So that's the center of my activism now, and I'm gonna stay in that corner for quite some time, because it's undermined in South Africa, it's undermined in Africa in general, and the finance that is available usually likes to look for innovation or like doing something new or whatnot. And there's nothing new about infrastructure. It's straightforward. Everybody knows exactly what's needed. And we can't put Africa under the pressure that Silicon Valley has for innovation when we haven't dealt with the bare minimum.
The bare minimum, which is around energy.
Which is around energy, right? So
the
so it is silly, right? The asset
rolling
allocation is
blackouts.
a bit unusual, right? Even the SME expenditures of like CIFA and other institutions, it's very, very peculiar. If you look at what our core problems are, right? It's not all hands on deck, let's solve the energy crisis, which is the single largest problem in the whole country. Macroeconomic risk, like it's an existential threat, you know?
Like the energy crisis. Because people don't, my whole passion right now is around like youth unemployment, right? The lack
Sure.
of joblessness, and how, for me, I'm interested in building a secure state. That's my contribution, right? In finding a way to have security for young people in this country. But I've always like, the impact of not having energy. It has a very direct impact on things like job creation, right? Things like providing healthcare, like how do their hospitals operate? So, yeah, do you think South Africa, do you think we're going to solve this situation anytime soon, given the impact that it's having?
Two statements on what you just said, right? According to the Minister of Electricity himself, 650,000 jobs were lost to load shedding last year. 650,000 jobs. 850,000 are planned to be lost this year due to load shedding. 1.1% of inflation is attributable to load shedding. So changing interest rates by the Reserve Bank and all this has got nothing to do with us. It's actually the main cause is the energy crisis. We're spending about 3 billion rand a month on diesel. So, I mean, that's the first thing about the context. And then you then ask, are we going to solve this? My answer to that question is yes and no, right? The problem is so intractable right now that the level of confidence we can have in terms of, and also we also are starting to start hearing different definitions of what solving this means, right? Some people just feel like if we move to a state where we have stage 1 and stage 2 load shedding, then we've solved the energy crisis, right? There are people are starting to think like that even, because it's so impossible to think of an energy secure South Africa that we start settling for such nonsensical things like let's have stage 1 and stage 2 and then like that's the state of affairs. We're decommissioning power stations. The new power stations that are supposed to be built can't be built because there's no grid capacity in Northern Cape, Western Cape, and Eastern Cape. So even if you build them there, you can't move the energy from wherever you've built it to where it needs to go, which is what transmission is. And so on. So do I think that we're going to solve the energy crisis within the foreseeable future? I'm not going to lie. The answer to that question is no. I don't think so. Do I think we're going to make really large dents in terms of solving the energy crisis? Yes. Is what our company is doing also very important in trying to find faster ways to do that? Yes, but that's under intellectual protection. But but point of that is we are now able to start looking at other provinces and not the standard provinces, which would need for you to build new grid capacity. We are now coming up with a solution where you can just build renewable energy resources anywhere in the country, unconstrained by grid or by the strength of the sun or anything like that. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, guys, we're all splitting hairs. This is Africa. Every single place in Africa is good for doing solar energy or wind energy. Like we just have that as a gift as a continent, So yeah.
Thank you so much, Mli. And yeah, I'm just hearing your journey, from the foundations of like you experiencing challenges with bullying, navigating gender, and now, becoming this, energy entrepreneur wanting to solve the issues for society in general in the whole of South Africa, the continent. What advice would you have for somebody who is in your shoes right now, particularly someone who is struggling to find themselves, who's struggling to fit in and find their identity within the available options or the labels as a parting?
A parting thought. I think for me, my only advice is your internal processes must never be junior to your external processes. Working on the self is unmatchable. You solve the world's problems by working on yourself as well. So it's material to always make sure that the lens is because the point of the world is to pull your lens towards it. So making sure that you pull that lens towards yourself continuously. That's the best advice that I could give, and that's what I would have done in my life as well.
Thank you so much, Mli. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Safe Space. See you next time.